Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Today, I have a very different and very special episode for you all. This is something I'm really excited for. We have our very first real-life conversation on the Thinking in English podcast. My good friend Thomas from Village Green English is going to talk about the importance of Latin language in the modern world. What is the point of studying an ancient language like Latin? Should governments fund Latin study? And what are the connections between Latin and English? Hopefully, we will answer all of these questions in today's episode. Thomas has his own English education podcast and business, Village Green English, so check out all of his links in the description. Go and give them a follow on Instagram and have a look at their website. I appeared as a guest on their last episode of the Village Green English podcast, so you can head over there to hear me answer their questions. Thomas is also a Latin teacher, so if you want to learn Latin, I'm sure he'd help you do that as well. I have been wanting to host conversations on my podcast for over a year. It is important to also highlight natural and real conversations for all of you. So, over the next few months, look out for more interviews with English teachers, but also with speakers of English as a second language. And if you want to have a conversation with me on Thinking in English, or you know someone who would be a great guest, just send me a message. I'd love to have some of my listeners appear on the podcast with me. So head over to thinkinginenglish.blog for the full transcript of today's episode. There is a vocabulary list, but I'm going to put it at the end of the episode if you're listening. However, you can go to the description of the podcast or the blog to read it throughout the episode. And give me a follow on Instagram. So, let's get started with the first ever conversation on Thinking in English. I was reading a newspaper article in the Guardian newspaper late last year about the UK government's intention to introduce something called the Latin Excellence Fund. This £4 million fund would be used to teach more students Latin in the UK, especially students from state schools or, in other countries, public schools. Latin has traditionally been quite an elite subject, generally taught at the most expensive private schools and then studied at top universities like Oxford and Cambridge. But why do we need Latin in the modern world? And why is the UK government funding Latin? And should they fund Latin? Now, I was going to write and research my own podcast on this topic. However, I then remembered that I have a good friend who is an English teacher, has his own English podcast, and also studied Latin at high school and university. So, here is my friend, Tom. How are you, Tom?
Hey, Tom. I'm all right. I'm very well, thanks. I'm doing my best to try and enjoy the nice weather in Italy, but I've been here for a week and the weather's actually awful. It's been raining most of the time and it's really cold.
Right. So it's
otherwise I'm well.
Important to mention there's a bit of a time difference between the two of us. I'm in Tokyo, as my listeners I hope know by now, and you are in Italy.
It's just hit 5 o'clock here.
Just hit 1 a.m. here, so normal times for both of us. So I think if we could start with sort of who are you, right? Can you give me a brief, very short introduction to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Tom. Well, to most of my friends, I'm Tom. To most of my students, I'm Thomas. You mentioned I'm a teacher. I'm an English teacher. I teach English 100% online. I mostly teach adults. And I usually teach intermediate to advanced learners, lots of conversational English. And I try and teach in a way that covers some interesting topics. Actually, a lot of the topics you talk about in your podcast are the sorts of things I like to teach, the kind of resources I like to use to help my students develop their English understanding, their speaking skills, and all of that. And actually, I push a lot of my students in your direction and recommend they do listen to your podcast.
Very, very thankful for that. And just mention Thomas. Let's call you Thomas. Thomas also has his own podcast, Village Green English, which I have been a guest on. So if you'd like to hear me speaking some more, you can go over and listen to his content. But I haven't really invited Thomas onto this podcast for his English teaching today. I want to know about Latin. Latin is a language I've never studied and never really thought about. And I think we should start from the beginning, right? Can you tell me what is Latin and where does it come from?
So Latin is a language, first and foremost. And it comes from Italy. It comes from where I am right now. It's the language of the ancient Romans. And it's a really, really interesting language because most people in the Roman Empire didn't actually speak Latin. The most common language was Greek, and it was the lingua franca, as we call it, the sort of common language of most people. But what it was the official language. It's the language of law, of rhetoric as well. And we'll, I guess, get onto what rhetoric is all about soon. It's the language of the government in that sort of sense. And so it's a really important language to the ancient Romans. And it's also the language of literature in ancient Rome. Now, a lot of stuff was written in Greek as well, because the Greeks had a long tradition of writing. And the Romans, they loved Greece. They loved ancient Greek philosophy. They loved its art. They loved its literature, its drama. They loved Greek plays and Greek philosophy as well. They loved it.
Yeah. So, how many people speak Latin today?
It's probably numbered in the hundreds. Right. I would have said maybe thousands.
Yeah. So this is why I've I wanted to introduce this topic today, because we're not talking about a language like French or a language like I don't know, Afrikaans, or even a small indigenous language from Brazil, right? We're talking about a language which is no longer spoken. And well, where do we see Latin, right? Where is Latin where do we find it today?
Yeah, exactly. Where is Latin? It's a really good question. Mostly it's in the Vatican, in the heart of the Catholic Church. And the reason for that is because, well, in a sense, the Pope and Catholicism is a sort of continuation of the Roman Empire. And it really, really is. It genuinely is. And through European history, the church, the Catholic Church, has been incredibly important. And it was a kind of non-governmental form it was an institution which ranged from Scotland to Ethiopia, right? And it was effectively the remnants of the Roman Empire. Kings had to pay homage. Kings and queens had to pay homage to the Pope. The word, the name for the Pope comes from the word pontiff, which comes from the Roman government position, the Pontifex Maximus, who was the head priest of Rome. And this was an incredibly important political position, not just religious. So to the ancient Romans, religion and politics were part of the same thing, part of governance.
Right.
And yeah, the Roman Catholic Church is a continuation of that.
Yeah, so we often see Latin in religious contexts, and I think it was either until the 1950s or 60s that Catholic churches around the world used to conduct services in Latin exclusively, and even in the UK and Ireland, where we didn't speak Latin, people would have to learn Latin to go to their Catholic services at church. But we also see Latin in, I guess, medical context as well, right? And science and biology and all of these different topics.
Absolutely. And that's where Latin has this other side of it, which is all about learning, which is kind of my I'm not a religious person. I went to a Church of England school, but some of the people that I've studied Latin with at university, for example, had been introduced to Latin because they went to a Catholic school or they were part of their local church.
Yeah. So I think we skipped ahead slightly. So when did you start studying Latin, and how did you get interested in this dead language?
Yeah, so I was waiting for you to use the term dead language because Latin lives. And anyone who has studied or taught Latin will know that phrase.
All languages are dead. They don't live.
It's true. So I started studying Latin. Now, I went to a comprehensive school, a state school, if you like. And I was incredibly fortunate to be given the opportunity to study classics. So classics is not just Latin, but it's Latin and everything else to do with ancient Rome and ancient Greece.
Yeah, it's very rare in the UK to have that opportunity unless you go to an elite grammar school or a private school. So the UK education system is a whole nother topic. So basically, myself and Tom, we both went to, or myself and Thomas, I should say, we both went to, I guess, free government-run schools in our local towns. We did so. It's very rare to, at these kinds of schools, be offered these more elite subjects,
niche
subjects, right?
Let's say.
Yes. So
again, it is really interesting. So I think it's less than 3% of state schools teach Latin. So again, there is a difference between Latin and classics, but they're very similar.
Yes.
We can kind of talk about them in the same sort of sense, but when it comes to statistics, it does make it a little bit trickier. But it's something like less than 3% of state schools compared to just under 50% of private schools. Now, that's an enormous difference.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you meet someone who learnt Latin or classics, then the chances are they probably come from a private school. And because of our education system, that also sort of means something. Someone who goes to private school has parents who can afford it. So it means they're part of a different demographic to us. And it's like looking at our politicians. What percentage of our politicians went to private school? Well, it's a very different number to the proportion of just people, of the population that went to private school.
Yeah, exactly. And if you've listened to my podcast on insulting Boris Johnson, which I recorded back in January. Yeah, I know Tom has. He sent me a message saying he enjoyed it. Some of the insults Boris Johnson uses are rooted in his education because he learned Latin at school. And if you listen to him speak, and some of his contemporaries in the British politics, they will use Latin in their daily language, which is very strange because, like Tom said, only 3% of British state schools, so the normal schools of the UK, teach Latin. And I would assume that out of the schools that offer Latin, maybe only 5% of students there actually take the class. So it's a very, very small number of people who learn Latin. And it's kind of a demonstration of your educational background. So you studied Latin or classics at secondary school. And when you went to university, what did you study there?
So just to quickly note on my experience of studying classics at school is, I think, unfortunately far too typical of the state of classics in state education in UK.
Okay.
In that the teacher who set up the classics A level that I took left before he could actually teach any of it. And then the other teacher who helped him to do that then left after the first year. So we had to get a new teacher in for my final year. So, it was abandoned as soon as it was introduced. So the school only did classics for 2 years. That happened to be the same 2 years I went through sixth form.
Yeah, and we'll get back to this later on. But this is what the Latin Excellence Fund is from the government is for. It's because there isn't enough Latin teachers out there. So
Absolutely.
After you. I guess we don't graduate in the UK, but after you graduated from high school, you went on to study at university. And what did you study there?
So my course was called Classics. And again, to kind of reiterate this idea that there are not many classicists in the country, At my graduation from university, I was the only student in my whole year who had the course title Classics. So there were lots of people doing classical civilization or archaeology,
Ancient
history. Yeah. Or I went to the University of Liverpool, and they have the system where you can mix and match lots of degrees. So, for example, my ancient Greek classes. So I did half of my degree was Latin and ancient Greek. The other half was spent in ancient history modules, literature modules, or archaeology modules. And most of my sort of pals from my course were archaeologists.
Right. Yeah. So we call this joint honours in the UK. And I graduated with a joint honours in politics and history. But yeah, it's very common. So if anyone's wanting to study in the UK, we don't really have, well, some universities offer a major minor system, but it's much more common in the UK to do a joint honours, 50-50 split.
Yeah. So for example, my Greek classes ended in my second and third year only being 3 students. There was myself doing classics. There was a girl doing music and ancient Greek, and a girl doing business and ancient Greek. And so I did for a lot of my university time kind of feel a little bit isolated, because my sort of group of friends on my course, none of them were doing any Latin or Greek. And my sort of my Latin classes, although they were, exceptionally lovely people, and always very warm, welcoming, and very kind, they were actually of different years as well, because I'd done some Latin before, but not an A-level in it. I kind of joined in the intermediate group. And so, I didn't feel like everyone was sort of having the same experience as I was having.
Right. So kind of, I guess, leaving behind your education, what is the point in studying Latin, right? why should people study Latin? And why is the government wanting people to study Latin?
So it's a really valid question, and it's something that classics and Latin teachers need to be aware of. And actually, we haven't mentioned this yet, but I am actually a classics teacher. I have a PGCE.
I forgot you studied. you studied.
I did, yeah. So I have a PGCE in Latin and classics, and I've taught in a state school and a private school. So I've got a little bit of a snapshot into both of those areas. And it's interesting when you train to be a maths teacher, you never have to think, why do we need to teach maths? Or am I ever going to be in a position where I'm going to go to a school and have to convince someone that we should be teaching maths?
Yeah, of course.
It doesn't happen. But with classics, it's absolutely part of the job. And there are loads of charities and institutions up and down the country that promote it. A great one, which I joined recently, is called the Working Classicists. So it's workingclassicists.com, and you can go and check it out. They're great. And if you want to learn a bit more about classics in the modern day, I would absolutely recommend going over there. And I'm going to do a shameless plug here, and that I actually wrote an article for them.
Oh, amazing.
On their website. Yeah, which you can go and read. And it's absolutely, that's something that has just become part of classics, is having to defend it, having to fight in its corner. And it is really interesting now, because classics is something that used to be taught in most schools, in possibly all schools.
Yes, I think so.
Our parents' generation, or maybe just a little bit older, would probably remember,
grandparents, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. As a kid, one of the things you did in primary school was learning Latin. And there's a few reasons why it sort of dropped off the face of the UK education system. One of them being that you no longer had to do it to go to Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, that used to be something. If you wanted to go to one of those universities, you had to have done Latin. They got rid of that. I don't know when they got rid of that, but once they did that, most schools stopped seeing the point of it. So that's kind of explained why it's a question, and it is a big question.
So what is the point now? Right?
Yeah, so I'm dancing around it.
Yeah.
There are loads of reasons, right? So for me, education part of education is not just teaching kids stuff, but teaching kids to want to learn. And the whole culture of learning about ancient Rome and ancient Greece is all about a desire for learning, a desire to be educated. The Renaissance, in part of European history, is the rebirth, and the Renaissance is basically where we get the modern university from. Now, there's a couple of universities which are medieval, but this idea of that people can learn, people want to go to school. The Enlightenment, this idea of wanting to learn, education, in its roots has the rediscovery of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, because the Greeks were obsessed with learning. They gave us philosophy and art, and these things go older. They are older than the Greeks, but the Greeks really, really loved it, and they fostered this culture of wanting to think and wanting to be educated and wanted to learn. And the Romans loved it too, and they wrote loads of it down. And so this kind of Roman word ars, or art, isn't just about art. It's about study, and it's about literature and wanting to be a better, more intelligent person. And so for me, learning about the classics is almost like learning about education itself. It really fosters a love of wanting to learn at a higher level. And I think anybody who wants to go to university, for example, should be interested in classics.
Right. And so you are currently working as an English teacher. And as I mentioned before, you've started your own English podcast. And I'm kind of curious about the links between Latin and English, because I'm sure, as some of my listeners know, English is a Germanic language. The closest language to English is, I think, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a language spoken in the Netherlands, Frisian maybe.
Frisian, yeah.
Frisian, yeah. So it's not a Latin language. However, over 50% of our vocabulary is is Latin in origin, I guess, mainly from Old French. So I wonder, now you've transitioned into English teaching, and in the future you might transition back into classics teaching. What are the links that you've kind of discovered and learned between the language you speak and the language you study?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, Latin being this old language, it's sort of something that all European languages can look to as almost, if not a parent, maybe an uncle kind of language to it. And you see that in grammar. The German, it's obviously a Germanic language, but grammatically, it actually borrows a lot from Latin. Now, I'm not a linguist. I haven't sort of studied languages as much as I perhaps could have, but Latin has always been the language of writing. And most of that was because the only people who knew how to write through European history were people in religious positions, monks and priests. They were the people who wrote things down, and they would have written in Latin. And so a lot of grammar in a lot of European languages is borrowed from Latin. So that's one thing that you see as similar. But again, the other thing about it is that Latin has always been an international language. And so it's been used for international uses, for international things. And again, the church is an international thing. The Bible is a book that has been transported across different countries. Being able to understand it, no matter what language you speak in your everyday, is important. And one thing you see a lot of is the roots of words coming from Latin. Lots of prefixes and suffixes like un and pre in the English language come from Latin because they mean something. And those are things that you can find in other languages as well. And as you said earlier about the sort of use of Latin in scientific and medical positions, again, it comes back to this idea that Latin is the language of learning. It's the language of intelligence. And different countries, whether they speak Polish or Romanian, they use those similar terms when it comes to science.
Yeah, and if any of the listeners currently listening to this podcast, maybe think about your language, especially if you're European. And I know I have a lot of Italian listeners, and that's quite an obvious link to Latin. But there are also, links to all other languages, especially around Europe and potentially into the Middle East and North Africa. There are links to Latin because this is where the Roman Empire stretched into these places. So yeah, think about your own language and think if there are any links. And this is something I've tried to emphasize in my podcast from the beginning, is that language changes. And English is a mess of pre-existing languages, from Celtic and Pictish through to Latin, mixed in with Anglo-Saxon, and then Scandinavian languages and the languages of Normandy, which are versions of Old French, and then modern French, and now mixed in with languages from Jamaica and Africa and other parts of Europe. We're a completely evolving language, and so are your languages. Languages are not static. So yeah, think about the links between Latin and your own language. And maybe some of my listeners can think about what words in English have Latin origins. And if you can think of any, let me know in the comments of the podcast on Spotify or on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. So, Tom, thank you so much for being my first guest on the Thinking in English podcast. And hopefully my questions were not too, my questions were fine. So let people know where they can find you and where they can find the Village Green podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So me and my colleague Nathan are part of Village Green English, which we've just founded. We are running a podcast, but also we are both English teachers. So if you head over to vgenglish.com, then you will find our website where you can book a lesson, you can listen to our podcast, and you can join our community of English language learners.
Yeah, I hope I get a referral fee for any students you get from me. But yeah, Tom is an old friend of mine, and as he's a qualified teacher both in English and in Latin. So maybe you could ask him to teach you a bit of Latin as well while you're over there.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do it.
Definitely. So check out their YouTube channel. It's Village Green English.
Yeah, our YouTube channel is Village Green English.
And the website?
And the website is vgenglish.com.
Yeah, and if you head over to their YouTube's channel, you should be able to see me on their site by now. I think this should be released in April, and potentially you will have my podcast up earlier, so you can go over and have a look at my beautiful face talking. I talk for far too long in their podcast, so they might have edited me out of it, but we'll see.
Yes, it's just going to be us two talking.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Tom, for being a guest. And yeah, definitely check out Village Green English. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So here is today's final thought. That was the first ever guest on the Thinking in English podcast. And again, I have to say thank you to Thomas from Village Green English for joining me. So make sure you go over to their website, vgenglish.com, and their YouTube channel, Village Green English, as well as looking at their Instagram page and Twitter. I'll have all of the links in the description of the podcast. Go and offer your support, give them a follow, and yeah, say hello. And definitely watch or listen to the episode they recorded with me. So, what do you think? Should we still study Latin today? Should governments fund Latin classes, or should they concentrate on more useful modern languages? What languages did you study at school? And does your language have a connection to Latin? Let me know in the comments on the blog on thinkinginenglish.blog. Leave a comment on Spotify or send me a message on Instagram. And also let me know what you thought about this episode. This is the first ever interview conversation style podcast I've done. And I would really love all of your feedback. Let me know what was good, what could be improved. And As I said at the beginning, if you would like to be a guest, just send me a message and I'm sure we can have a conversation in the future, especially if you have something you'd like to promote to other people, maybe a business or a blog or a podcast that you're doing in English. But here is the vocabulary list for this episode. And thank you for listening so far. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is in the description of the podcast and also on the Thinking in English blog. Lingua franca. Lingua franca. A language used for communication between groups of people who speak different languages. Remnant. Remnant. A small piece or amount of something that is left from a larger original piece or amount. To pay homage. To pay homage. To show deep respect and praise for a person or god. Governance. Governance. The way that organizations or countries are managed at the highest level, and the systems for doing this. Fortunate. Fortunate. Fortunate means lucky. Elite. Elite. Belonging to the richest, most powerful, best educated, or best trained group in society. Demographic. Demographic. Relating to the study of populations and the different groups that make them up. A-level. A-level. A-levels are British high school or sixth form exams. Reiterate. Reiterate. To say something again, once or several times. Module. Module. A course or a part of a degree at college or university. PGCE. PGCE. This is the British teaching qualification you need to teach at state or government-funded schools. Snapshot. Snapshot. A piece of information or short description that gives an understanding of a situation at a particular time. Classicist. Classicist. Someone who studies the classics. Fight something's corner. Fight something's corner. To defend something that you believe in by arguing. Renaissance. Renaissance. The period of new growth of interest and activity in the areas of art, literature, and ideas in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. Enlightenment. Enlightenment. The period in the 18th century in Europe when many people began to emphasize the importance of science and reason rather than religion and tradition. To foster. To foster. To encourage the development or growth of ideas or feelings. To transition. To transition. To change or make someone or something change from one form or situation to another. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really appreciate every single person who takes the time to listen to my podcast. Make sure you head over to the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, so you can read the whole transcript of today's episode and look at some of the other content I upload onto the blog. You can also check out my Instagram page. I post very regularly, and if you want to message me, I always reply to people on Instagram. Please leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Leave a rating on Spotify. You can do that now, and I trying to get to 150 ratings by the end of February. Please recommend to all of your friends and maybe share on social media. And why not go back and listen to a few of the old episodes? It's one of the best ways to support the podcast. You can also donate on the Thinking in English blog by going to the support page. And yeah, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.